everyone, and welcome to another horse racing hangout with Amplify Horse Racing. My name is Anise Montpleasure. I'm the executive director of Amplify, which, if you've never heard of Amplify, we're a nonprofit to educate youth and young adults about the thoroughbred industry. Our monthly horse racing hangouts are essentially a virtual workshop to help educate people, whether you want to get more involved in the industry or actually pursue a career in the thoroughbred industry. These are some awesome, tangible workshops with excellent takeaway points where you can get out your notebook, take some notes, and actually really learn something that can help you to advance your career or just simply advance in your knowledge, or even if you're just seeking out some continuing education opportunities, this is a really excellent way of doing that. So for anybody out there that's eating lunch, pull up your lunch, grab your notebook, and get ready to do some learning, because we really have an awesome presentation for you today. Our subject is horse racing ethics, which I was really excited when I had approached the University of Arizona Racetrack Industry Program, which is going to be our presenting group today, and asked if they would be willing to join us for a hangout. And when they proposed this topic, I was really enthused about it, because it's an important subject to understand for anyone who wants to pursue further involvement in the industry. Many of us who got into thoroughbred racing probably did it for the love of the horse, and we want to be good stewards of the horse, good stewards of the industry, and continue to improve. And so it's important to understand the challenges and criticisms that are faced, or that we face in the space of ethics, in order to address them and continue to make a positive difference for the future of the industry. So today you're going to learn the definition of ethics, how ethics in the thoroughbred industry has evolved over time, how the industry has addressed them, and really where we're at today. So before we really dive in, I also want to make a note on the age appropriateness of this conversation. Amplify has a pretty wide age range that we seek to educate, but I would say that today's presentation is going to be best suited for those who are in high school and college, some of those older, slightly upper level students. This is going to be, I wouldn't quite say mature content, but we will talk about gambling along the way. We're going to be talking a little bit about equine welfare. So if there are any parents watching, excellent, welcome. Just be prepared to maybe have some conversations with your kiddos about this info. So that's my note on age appropriateness. We always welcome you to send in your questions and comments. So anywhere that you are watching from, whether you're on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, please do type in the comments. We can actually bring your questions live up on screen, which is awesome. But with that, we always want you to be respectful. I'm very aware that ethics can be a slightly sensitive conversation. And so with that, please respect your fellow audience members. Please respect our speaker today, and keep that in mind as you send in your questions and comments. Today, as I mentioned, our presenter is with the University of Arizona Racetrack Industry Program. So we're really, really lucky to have Phil O'Hara, RTIP's Assistant Professor of Practice, with us. And then also we have RTIP's Chair, Robert Hartman, who's going to be moderating the comments. So if you have any questions specifically about their program, how to apply, what kinds of students they accept, go ahead and send those in as well. We can answer a little bit of everything and anything. And Robert, hey there, thank you so much for being on with us as well. And so with that, I'm going to share Phil's bio with you. When we have speakers, I don't usually read off their whole bio because it takes a little while. But again, because this is such a big, in-depth topic, I really wanted to illustrate to all of you the depth of experience that Phil has to share in his own career in the thoroughbred industry. So Phil O'Hara has over 30 years experience as an executive in the thoroughbred racing industry in a wide variety of positions. Since August of 2020, he has taught classes for the racetrack industry program at the University of Arizona. Prior to joining U of A, he was consulting with industry organizations through his company, PT O'Hara Junior Services Incorporated. O'Hara served on the board of directors of the Daily Racing Form's parent sports information group. He held the position of executive director of track partnerships and worked with the U.S. Trotting Association to integrate harness racing coverage and retail data on drf.com. He served as the executive director and CEO of the Mid-Atlantic Cooperative, LLC, a simulcast content buying cooperative. O'Hara was the president and CEO of Equibase Company, the thoroughbred industry's official database, a partnership between the TRA and the Jockey Club. He also served as chairman of Access Trackmaster, an Equibase subsidiary, which is a data and handicapping product retailer. Prior to joining Equibase, he served as Penn National Gaming's executive VP, overseeing the company's parimutuel assets, the racing segment of its business. O'Hara served as a director of the TRA for 12 years and was an active member of the 1995 and 2020 committees of the TRA. Before joining Penn National, O'Hara served in a variety of positions in the marketing and racing departments at several racetracks, including Tampa Bay Downs, Arapahoe Park, and Louisiana Downs. And he is a graduate of the University of Arizona's racetrack industry program. So with that, welcome, Phil, and thank you so much for being on this horse racing hangout.
Well, thank you, Anise. That was a mouthful of all those things. I thought you'd just maybe pick a couple of them and throw them out there, but
no, you
yeah,
have a great level of experience to be able
as,
to share with everyone. I think it's good to highlight that too, in case somebody has questions about your background and to be able to kind of see your journey into the industry as well.
well, as you can tell by my beard, it's bright white now, and before I did all those things in the industry, it used to be pretty dark. So you can tell I've actually been in the trenches.
Well, you have a lot of wisdom to share. You've seen many things, and I do also want to say hi. I'm guessing this is Robert here who's tuned in. Great to be here. Thanks, Robert, and thank you guys for all that you have to share with us. So, Phil, I guess before we really dive into the conversation itself, I would love it if you would give us a brief overview of the University of Arizona Racetrack Industry Program. You know, what does the program entail? What kind of students generally apply?
So the program has evolved from the time I went to school here. When I went to school here, we had 4 total racetrack classes. The equine program began the last year I was here, so I didn't participate in that. So there wasn't a lot of in depth. But what we've always done well is we've brought in experts from around the industry that actually share their experience and their knowledge with our students. Type of students we get are, well, first of all, we have 2 tracks. One is an equine track, which predominantly is students that want to learn about breeding programs. Maybe their aspiration is to operate a breeding farm. But we also have a lot of students that want to be trainers. We had a student that has interned with Shug McGahee up in New York the last several summers, who's graduating this year. And I believe he's going to spend a little time at Claiborne this summer
Awesome.
in your neck of the woods. But we also have students that interned last year with Delmar. We had a student that interned in the racing department at Saratoga and Belmont Park last summer. So we provide that. But now the curriculum is probably about 20 classes. On the racetrack, the people that want to be in the operations side of the business, we have about 8 classes that are, basically soup to nuts of everything you need to know to actually go operate as a racing official in the racing department, or
Mhm.
if you aspire to run a racetrack or one of the corporations that operate racetracks. We have several students that are inclined or inspired to try to do something like that. But it evolves just like everything else. And I think Robert will tell you we've got uh, really bright young folks in our program right now. We're kind of excited to see how they do in the industry.
That's awesome. I've met several current students and former students of the program, and I only have great things to say. And it really sounds like there are a wide variety of students with different interests. They come from different parts of the country that have found this program to be really well suited and laying the foundation of their education for the industry. So thank you so much for sharing about that. And moving into our presentation part of it, I'm going to kind of step out of the picture and just hand it over to you, Phil, because you're the expert on this. And again, I want to let people know that they can type in the questions. I did see Susan. Hello, Susan. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon. She's a big fan of Amplify. So, people type in your questions and comments, and I'll be monitoring. Robert will be monitoring, and Phil, take it away.
I'll be talking.
We love it. I'm going to be here taking notes as well.
Sounds good. Well, it's interesting. Thank you. Now I don't have to give a lot of my background. I would share a little bit about how I got started. For me, I was a fan growing up. I think my dad probably started taking, I'm from Pittsburgh. So my dad started taking me to Waterford Park when I was 9 or 10 years old. And that was my relationship with horse racing, was going down and trying to handicap and pick some winners. When I returned from the Marine Corps, a whole new world was opened up to me because my father had just bought his first racehorse. Anyway, the horses we had operated in the Maryland circuit, and the general manager at the time's name was Chick Lang. His son was actually our jockey's agent, and I became close with him. He's the one that told me about the University of Arizona. And honestly, from that first summer of being involved on the really in depth in the sport, the study of ethics, at least partially the study of ethics internally anyway, started. And I think if you talk to anybody that makes a career in racing, ethics and doing the right thing for horse racing is a cherished obligation that we feel, and we feel it really deeply. For me, especially ethics, I have this like hyperactive sense of ethics. So I've actually changed jobs way more than most people. And predominantly because I've run into conflicts with certain stances maybe the company I'm working for takes that I don't necessarily buy. Anyway, doing the right thing may not make you as much money in the short term, but I'm a believer that over a course of time, your company will make more money when you're doing the right thing, because you won't be subjected to the public outcries that take place, like when we have a rash of breakdowns or some mistreatment of a horse on your backstretch or something like that. Anyway, so when I think back of my 43 years in the industry, I know that my moral compass kind of gets influenced by all the different things that you experience, right? Anyway, nothing has more deeply affected my personal code than the time I spent in Kentucky, which was about close to a decade, and especially seeing the way uh, the love of the horse by not just the operators of the racetrack at Keeneland or Churchill, but not just the breeders at those magnificent farms, but pretty much everybody that lives there has this, you know, real desire to make sure that we're doing the right thing by the horse. And for me, with my experience in the overall racing game, I want to make sure we're doing the right thing, not only for the horse, but as well as the jockey that rides the horse, the grooms that actually work with the horses in the daytime, and the people that bet on our races are looking for those things. Anyway, but isn't that what we're supposed to do when we're actually exposed to something new? That's supposed to go into our evaluation process, right? Of what we think is right and wrong and how we'd like to go. So I could have the next slide now. So anyway, let's just briefly talk about ethics in general, right? So we've all been raised to live by a moral code, and that moral code originally comes from our parents, right? The way that our family raises us. As we encounter life's issues, we modify that code to address more specialized matters, kind of like things that we run into on a day-to-day basis, right? Uh, anyway, the more and more that we do revise this code, some of these things become a little ambiguous, raising internal conflicts. So it isn't always a yes or no or black and white issue for us. There's a lot of gray areas when we're dealing with ethics. But we're not alone in this conundrum. Think of it: the branch of ethics is also a branch of knowledge that deals with moral principles, right? So this has been being discussed since Aristotle and Plato back in the day. And to start with, when we started using the term ethics, it always included an analysis of truth, virtue, and logic. They were the components that made up ethics, right? Uh, and those components and the principles of ethics, they're contained in our deepest recesses. And that's who makes us who we are as individuals, right? Anyway, so for me, it's always been pretty easy to determine what's ethical or what the doing the right thing is, because when you've been required to maybe go against or in conflict with some of your moral code, don't you always get like that queasy feeling in your stomach to know? Anyway, next slide, please. All that said, each person has an individual interpretation of what is ethical, right? This is true in medicine, and we're seeing it in society today, right? There's a portion of the population that thinks that a woman has 100% control over her bodily functions, right? And then there's a portion of the population that thinks that the reproductive part of that should be controlled by government and laws, right? Anyway, regardless of which way you stand, and I'm not taking a position on either, we know that everybody has been raised to believe the things that they believe with regard to their ethics evaluation, right? Uh, anyway, again, that evaluation is of your personal ethics, and it's influenced by your upbringing, and then various experiences that you encounter, and then additionally, societal pressures, right? Could I have the next slide, please? So, anyway, I got into the game in the late 70s. I had just returned from serving in Okinawa with the United States Marine Corps. And I could tell you, my moral code then was very primitive, right? I knew the game from going to Waterford Park, which is a low level racetrack in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. Anyway, uh, my first introduction to real racing and being associated with racing as an insider became, something that I had to learn all of the accepted practices, right? So as a racing official, I'd be working in the racing office, and we'd get a new trainer in, and somebody would say, "Oh, that guy, that guy has the best way to block leg pain by using certain medications that they're not testing for. And he was kind of like uh, a, a hero to people because he was able to win races with horses that were sore enough that they couldn't train for other trainers. And he did win a lot of races. I think eventually he was caught and ruled off of the races. But at that time, it was not considered to be completely taboo, right? Owners in the claiming game. If you don't know what claiming races are, horses are actually categorized by the value that we see they could operate in. So if you have a $20,000 horse and you try to run for a 50,000 claimer, chances are you're not going to be competitive there, right? So you would actually run at the level of uh, uh, competition that you can actually either win or get a check in your race, right? So when horses started to go bad, there may be a medical procedure like draining fluid from a knee. You drain fluid from the knee knowing that you're not going to be able to do that every race. So you're going to drop your horse in and hope somebody else would claim him. This was actually perceived as a practice by a crafty trainer. If you had a really smart, crafty trainer, he'd be able to navigate that situation, right? And then some of the other practices were like, as a horse was declining in ability, uh, a trainer may just try to get that last race out of the horse so that they could get another check, really looking after the owner's economic interests, right? And again, I'm not judging any of this. I'm just saying this is the way it was in the 70s. So jump forward another 20 years. Could I have the next slide, please? The ethics of the early 2000s. We had several issues come up in the decade of the 2000s that really started to wake the industry up. First of all, in 2002, we had an employee of one of the tote companies. By the way, tote is the actual computer systems that process the wagers. Anyway, this employee of the tote company was able to get inside the pools, write his own tickets for the Breeders' Cup Pick Six, and ended up cashing. I think it was about $3 or $4 million worth of tickets, and he got caught only because there were so many long shots that day that he held the only tickets. I believe he had 11, but don't quote me on that. And as soon as it was identified that there was one location that had 11 winners and no other location in the country had any winners, everybody got pretty suspicious pretty quick, and we caught the guy. Uh, but those were issues that we identified that we weren't doing a good enough job to protect our pools from people coming in trying to manipulate and actually cheat the other bettors, right? We also had some high profile bookmaker offshore illegal gambling cases that came up. Some involved paying trainers to drug their horses to win, and they were actually caught again by the FBI. I believe there were 17 indictments in this Uvari IRG case. What they did was they took the bookmaking money that was being bet, dumped it into the U.S. pools through a rogue ADW in North Dakota. Again, those are things that, you know, we really didn't take seriously until they happened, but we did address them after. So again, we're evolving. Some really high profile horse racing issues also came up, right? The winner of the Kentucky Derby in 2006 was Barbaro, who was this magnificent animal. I remember being at the Derby that year, and when he came around the turn, you could see he fanned out wide and made the move. It was incredible. But 2 weeks later, He went into the gate at the Preakness as the prohibitive favorite for that race. He broke through the gate before the race started, went back around. They put him back in the gate, started the race. He made it about halfway down the stretch and right in front of the grandstand had a failure of one of his forelimbs and actually was vanned off in front of close to 100,000 people that were there for the Preakness. The thing about Barbaro's incident was it was such his battle to survive, to overcome his injury, was such a public interest story for the next 9 months that we followed every step, 7, 8, 9 months, something like that, that we followed every step of Barbaro's try to get to recovery. The owners spared no expense in vet care and trying to save him, that the country actually kind of got behind him. But just about 2 years, a little less than 2 years later, on Kentucky Derby Day, we had this magnificent 3-year-old filly, as she was pulling up after a race on Derby Day 2008, shattered both her front forelimbs. And that was probably the most immediate public outcry that I can ever remember in horse racing. And I would say within a week, the industry decided we really need to dig deep in on this. How are we going to adjust this so that our industry gets back in the direction that we want it to go, right? Next slide, please. So anyway, we had this vast industry awakening in response to this. And so what had happened was, I would say within a week of the breakdown of 8 Bells, we had safety committees popping up all over the country. Sure, California had some to address their issues. The Jockey Club Safety Committee started, shortly thereafter. And then in Lexington, the NTRA started to convene industry-wide safety committee meetings. And I was lucky to serve on a committee that started probably a week after the Derby. And we got into the brass tacks about a lot of things. So funniest thing is, within a couple weeks of the Derby, the horse that won the Kentucky Derby's name was Big Brown. He was trained by, one of the most gifted, talented horse trainers that we've seen, at least in my generation, Richard Dutrow. But he was being interviewed on national TV by Bob Costas, who anybody that follows sports knows Bob Costas's stances in sport and ethics in sport. He brought the steroid issue to baseball. He took them on. He brought the concussion issue to football. He took the NFL on. So he was interviewing Richard Dutrow, and we were talking about 8 Bells. Somebody was surmising that 8 Bells was using steroids. And at the time, steroids were legal. So no criticism of Larry Jones, because that was the ethics of the day, right? Steroids were actually allowed. Richard Dutrow on that national conversation actually said, my horses all get their steroid shot on the 15th of the month. And I would say shortly thereafter, there was an outcry that we needed to address the medications that were going into our horses. Anyway, so in response to this, we had significant changes that happened to permissive medication. Steroids were almost outlawed by the end of the year, which, at that speed is unheard of, trying to get 38 states to agree to that, right? The outcome of all of these safety meetings, and especially the NTRA orchestrated meetings, we developed our first ever code of safety and integrity standards. A lot had to do with medications, but we also had a lot of things at the racetracks that we thought could be done better, and we created a standard of safety accreditation for each of the racing venues around the country as well. And then lastly, the TRA tracks, which actually own a company called the TRPB, which is an investigative part of the company, actually created requirements for anybody wagering into our pools to have to undergo a due diligence investigation. That would have restricted access for any outliers that wouldn't go through that. So now we know we've at least taken steps to protect against one of those betting scandals as well. Next slide, please. So anyway, what are the premium ethical issues in racing? I always think of them as the two things that we use to regulate the sport, right? Our sport is highly regulated. Every state has their own racing commission, and they create the rule formats for each state. And by the way, they've been different. If you go to Kansas, which I don't think they race anymore, but if you go to Kentucky, their rules are going to be different than West Virginia. They're going to be a little different than Pennsylvania, and they're going to be a little different than Florida, right? But regardless, we're tasked to regulate the industry in a fair fashion. And the two things we really regulate, or the reason we regulate, is safety of all the participants, right? So we want to have the state-of-the-art safety requirements for the equine athlete from the time they're foaled, right? Actually, probably from the time they've been in gestation, because we want to make sure those things are safe for the broodmares themselves, right? And then once they're foaled, we want to make sure that no unethical surgeries are going to be hidden from any prospective owner of that foal going forward, right? With regard to the auction, do we think it's right for somebody that's prepping a horse for an auction to use steroids to build that horse's body out just so that its appearance can bring more dollars? Probably not, right? As a matter of fact, you certainly don't want the muscular part of the horse to outgrow the skeletal part of the horse, right? Their genetics make it so that those two parts are supposed to work together. Additionally, we want to make sure that training and racing metrics are followed so that we're taking care of those animals, right? And then lastly, in retirement, think of it. Most horses in horse racing race at 2, 3, maybe 4 years old. So, many go on beyond that, but the predominant number of horses are done racing at the age of 3 or 4. We need to find a way for them to enjoy a satisfactory, productive life the rest of their life. So we really had to take on issues of retirement, rehabbing, retraining, and all those things. And in the same time, we needed to create medication protocols so that everybody knew what the right thing was, right? With regard to the human participants, not just the jockeys on the back of the horses, but we also have grooms and trainers and other people that work with the horses all the time, right? We want to make sure that those backstretch facilities are as safe as they can be. Things like walking around the corner of a barn. If you don't have a mirror up in the corner of the barn to see there's a horse acting up, you might just walk into the back of that horse and get kicked in the face. Those type things, we wanted to distribute best practices. We wanted to make sure that accreditation would check on all those things and then let that track catch up to speed and make sure that they were performing those best practices. And then we also wanted to make sure our surfaces were safe, right? So we've done all kind of testing on the surfaces, because if in fact your track isn't keeping data on what went into that track or what came out of that track, what was the composition of the material the horses were running on. Just an example, if you have too much clay, you get a lot of rain, guess what? Your track is going to be sloppy for a lot longer period of time. If you don't have enough clay in the track to hold the moisture in and it's too sandy, guess what? That track is going to break away from those horses' hoofs when they're landing on it. But also there are better kind of rails that we can use to protect both the horse and the rider. And then just the simple maintenance things that you conduct at the track every day. Grooming horse pass after a thunderstorm, especially if you're on a terraced backstretch and that water starts running down, you're going to have washouts on that horse path, and somebody's going to take missteps in those, right? But also, the other thing that we really regulate is the integrity of the contest, right? We regulate medication issues for the conduct of the race as well, right? We also regulate that same thing with the conduct of the riders during the race. And then we also regulate that contest with the wagering aspects and making sure that our wagering pools are secure and the race is being run fairly so that our customers have a fair shake to actually make those wagers. Next slide, please. So, no matter what you try to do, you're always going to run into conflicts, right? And anyway, those are called ethical dilemmas, right? An ethical dilemma is basically the difficulty in choosing between two courses of action. Either choice involves disobeying one of those closely held moral principles that you may have, right? So those are things that you have to do. Next slide, please. You have to deal with those. So what are industry ethical dilemmas? Safety before else. And I think if you talk to anybody, especially an operator of the track, first thing out of their mouth is going to be safety before all else. But there's trade-offs due to costs, right? We're just going into this new federal law, and a lot of the small tracks are really troubled by the expenses that are going to be forced upon them, that they may not be able to make it, right? So safety before else is really, there are trade-offs due to cost for that, right? And then at the end of the day, a horse could step on another hoof print in the racetrack, twist his ankle, and, either catastrophically injure himself or hurt himself to the point that you get off. Foolproof security for racing medication policies. This is another one of those things that a trade-off for costs we're looking at. And just to let you know, we've passed a law. As a matter of fact, I'll get to HISA in like another slide or so. I have a little bit about that, talk about it. But anyway, the trade-off for foolproof security of racing medication policies is the best we can do is best practices, right? We have to have a way that we can test for all illegal medication. We have to have a way for when that test is completed that whoever is illegally using medication needs to be held accountable for what they're doing. And those kind of things are all top of mind for the regulators, and especially the Racing Commission regulators that currently are tasked for medication policies. I believe starting next week, it'll be under the new federal law and the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, which again, I'll get to in a minute or so. The technology to identify pool corruption instantaneously. So right now, there is an office in Delaware or in Maryland called the TRPB, and they have access to every transaction that is made on any U.S. racing in the thoroughbred world, right? I think they have contracts in the harness world as well, but I do know that the thoroughbred world, they have agreements with racing commissions as well as racing associations like Churchill Downs Incorporated, Penn National Gaming, New York Racing Association, the Stronach Group or First Racing. And right now they get access to all those transactions, but they don't have sufficient staff to be able to monitor that real time to prevent the pool corruption. All they can do is track it down and investigate it and hold that person accountable at a later date. Obviously, if you had unlimited funds, you'd probably be able to do that. And then also, tote companies. We have three major tote companies in this country. Um, they all each have a proprietary system of doing things, and their proprietary claims inhibit any free share of data for the general investigator to be able to look at. Anyway, so those are our dilemmas. Can you forward, Anise? So culturally speaking, now we go back to the ethics of the day. In 2019, we had a large amount of horse deaths in Southern California. And you know what? They had extreme weather. That was the culprit. Their racetracks are designed because they're semi arid for most of the year where they get no rain at all. Their racetracks are designed to, hold moisture. But when they got over abundance of moisture, it was hard for them to know exactly how that racetrack was happening. And I'm not blaming the deaths on the racetrack. There are a lot of things that go into that. But every day a horse died in there. Once it became a national story, every day a horse died, there was more outcry about stopping racing in California. Senator Dianne Feinstein actually recommended this may be the end of racing, and we need to consider outlawing, racing in California. Jump forward another year, and the Navarro service indictments. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but they were the two leading trainers at Monmouth Park. Along with them, there were 27 indictments for using illegal drugs as performance enhancing drugs that they were treating horses with, and they were winning. And think of it, Jason Service won the Kentucky Derby the spring before on maximum security. I mean, he was disqualified, but his horse actually won that. He had just finished winning the Saudi Cup, which is a $20 million race in Saudi Arabia, a month before these indictments came out. Anyway, we also identified a lot of illegal betting and pool manipulation that was occurring into the pools that was not transparent because they weren't actually betting into our pool so much. They were fooling around and trying to cash bets with the illegal bookmakers offshore. So it was kind of disguised to most of the regulators, weren't aware of it, but now we are, right? So in response to that, please forward this slide. In response to that, we had an outcry. It led to federal legislation known as the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act, which created an authority called the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority. The goal was to create uniform rules for all the thoroughbred tracks that nationally distribute their simulcast signal. That is the only federal intervention that could be made, was to disrupt interstate commerce from happening, because all about horse racing is local. It's all within your state, with the exception of the interstate commerce that is conducted through simulcasting of the races around the country. Anyway, so HISA then created safety rules. They followed along those lines of those code of standards that I talked about after the response for 8 bells, but they've ratcheted down some of these things to make it even safer for our participants. They're I believe, poised to begin their anti-doping and medication rules as of next week, or maybe the week after the Derby, I think they're talking about. I'm not exactly sure. But so the authority has actually hired some of the best people in the industry. They've got people on the board from the NFL doping policies to the operators of, or ex-operators of racetracks, to people that are politically connected. Governor of Kentucky, ex-governor of Kentucky, Steve Beshear is on that board, and they're all looking to do the best thing for thoroughbred racing, with the goal of making thoroughbred racing's longevity be a reality for us. Because I will say, a response to a lot of this thing and a public outcry, if it occurs, could be devastating in a lot of states. Uh, anyway, they also identified issues about aftercare when the racing career is completed. And, you know, places like, or organizations like Amplify can only be helpful in distributing this message. So it's great in that way. Anyway, next slide, please. So that's kind of my story today. Did want to share with you a little bit of parting thoughts. Anyway, I have a few notes that I haven't been following through the presentation, so let me grab a hold of those. So first of all, HISA has actually supposed to have been in effect since last July 1st, but certain participants in the industry feel that it's unconstitutional for them to intervene in the regulation of the sport because primarily it's always been a state's issue, right? So anyway, it's been held up, and I have a feeling that it's going to be out of the court system within the next week or two, but may continue. I don't know that for sure. But if HISA is eventually ruled constitutional, you know what? This industry needs to embrace the new reality, right? And we need to make it work, whether that be through collaboration of the overall or collaboration within the industry, or an actual overhaul of some of the initial regulations that HISA came out with. But anybody that's participating within our industry really needs to weigh in on this argument so that we make our regulations work fairly for everybody, and make sure that those regulations create a level playing field for both the races, all the participants, and the customers that bet on our races as well, right? We need to proactively really protect our courageous racing animals, make sure they're treated and cared for from the time they're foaled all the way through their retirement, right? Our industry will be evaluated every time we have a high profile issue that arises, right? Social acceptability is probably one of the biggest vulnerabilities that this industry has. I mean, I've heard the comment about the social license to operate. Well, I don't think that's just a talking point. If you look at the greyhound industry, it has basically disappeared, and it's disappeared for more than just societal issues. They didn't have the revenues that thoroughbred racing has. So there's an economic component to it disappearing, but they were actually voted out by referendum out of most major greyhound racing states, to the point that right now there are two racetracks that race greyhounds operating, and they're both in the state of West Virginia. So one of the other things that I think that we really need to address is our youth movement and the lack thereof, right? Our fan base is aging. And for us to do better, we need to find ways to interact with that fan base of the Gen Zs and the millennials. And if anybody doesn't think animal rights is top of mind for these generations, you're kidding yourself. They're raised to be animal rights, I don't want to say activists, but definitely supporters. And we have to make sure that we're doing that. And so these are the things that I think are crucial for us in addressing ethics and having a real industry ethics policy. Anyway, thank you, Anise. It was fun sharing with you.
Excellent presentation, Phil. I really appreciate that. And I think it was such a great, it was very well outlined in giving history on how ethics have evolved over time, and that, 30 years ago, what would be considered unethical today was, like you said, was not taboo in that era. And so, for young people to be able to understand the history and evolution of ethics, and to have an understanding of the efforts that the industry is making today to make a change, for the betterment of the safety and welfare of both horses and humans in the sport, is such an important topic,
No
to be
question. And
discussed.
no question. And the whole thing is you have to realize how progress works, right? You don't get to where you want to be in a day or with one change. It's step by step by step. And so we need to be at a point where we have dialogue between all of us that actually addresses these issues and makes them better. We have to get better and better and better. And you know what? I so I love the people that I've been associated with in this business, uh, and I respect the fact that they're all looking out for the best interest uh, of the business, the horses, the riders, and our fans.
There's definitely a lot of effort and research being put into all of these issues. And another, piece that I want to share with audience members out there, something interesting to look into if you're looking to further your knowledge on the space of equine welfare and some of the research that's being done, checking out the Grayson Jockey Club's Welfare and Safety of the Racehorse Summit recording. You can find that on YouTube. The last summit took place last year in 2022, and really provides an amazing overview of research that's being conducted to help, improve welfare of the horses, of our jockeys. And so, again, just another little continuing education plug out there. And I want to let people know this is your last chance to ask questions of Phil live. If you're watching the recording, you can certainly still send in your questions and comments, and I will do my best to circle back and get those answered. But, Phil, one thing I found really interesting, you mentioned the really how regulated the industry is. And I think that's something a lot of young people don't realize. Like when I do a lot of behind the scenes tours at racetracks, and at Keeneland College Scholarship Day, I take students into the paddock and into the winner's circle. And I always try to point out the racing officials. And I explain, this person is the horse identifier. They're scanning this horse's identifying microchip. This is the paddock judge. They're ensuring that all of these horses that are heading out to the track are wearing the equipment that they said they'd be wearing. So even all of those bits and pieces along the way that, a newcomer to the sport might not understand, all go towards ensuring the safety and integrity of the industry. And I do see we have a question from Miss Rachel Wagley. She was one of our mentees last year. Will we be seeing any changes in this year's Derby due to HISA and the phasing out of LASIX?
Well, so the good thing is, do you want me to answer that?
Yes,
Okay.
please, because you'd be the expert on this.
So the good thing is the LASIX in the Derby doesn't have to rely on HISA, because all graded stakes, if you want to participate in a graded stakes, you can't use LASIX. And so the Kentucky Derby will not have LASIX in its sources. And HISA, while it has a prohibition of LASIX, that's been put on pause for a 3-year study to make sure that if they're able to find out that LASIX is actually better to treat EIPH than no LASIX at all, that prohibition may be overturned in 3 years. So there will not be any LASIX in the Kentucky Derby this year.
Great question, Rachel. Thank you very much for asking that. Anybody out there who's not heard of EIPH before, that stands for exercise induced pulmonary hemorrhage. And another good thing for somebody to have a Google about. Or Phil, I don't know if you want to go ahead and explain that as well.
So Horses, the way they run and their back legs go up against their bellies, it pushes everything into their lungs. We believe that most horses have little microfractures of some of the uh, the lung tissue that allows for bleeding into the lungs. If that becomes severe, horses can actually bleed significantly, and sometimes you'll see a horse come back with blood running down its nose, or even in the worst cases, where a jockey's white pants will be covered with blood. Those horses are obviously in distress. Lasix has been used to treat that since the mid to late 70s. And it has worked. There's a lot of opponents of the use of Lasix because we're saying horse can't race without drugs. Does that make an ethical statement about racing if we're saying a horse needs drugs to race? That's part of the discussion that we're going through right now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great explanation. And again, for audience members out there, this would be a great presentation to step away and look at some of your own motivations and think about what you feel is ethical, what issues really speak to you, and being really well read and also well spoken as an ambassador of the industry on some of these things. Because if you're going to work in racing, you will undoubtedly have questions presented to you by friends, family members, people that you interact with that aren't directly connected to the sport. And these are all issues that are questions, I should say, to have your own thoughts and well-educated response to. So, Phil, thank you very much for today's excellent presentation.
It's great. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Awesome. And I know how people can find you if they have follow-up questions. So if anybody wants to reach out to Amplify, we are at info@amplifyhorseracing.org, and I can certainly pass those questions along to Phil and to Robert.
My mugshot is on the RTIP website at the University of Arizona.
There you go. If you want to read up again on Phil's bio, you can certainly do that. And we will be having some posts over the next couple months of student testimonials and facts about RTIP. So audience members can certainly follow those to learn about the program, or head to the University of Arizona Racetrack Industry Program to learn more. And with that, Phil, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Great to spend time with you.
Thanks so much. And thank you to all of you for tuning in to this episode. It was certainly a very in-depth episode. And so again, I really encourage you, if you have follow-up questions, if you need clarification on any of those points, or maybe even consider rewatching the episode to be able to absorb more of the material, because it certainly is a very deep conversation to be had. And there has been quite an evolution over time in the industry when it comes to ethics. So I'm thrilled that we were able to present this episode to you. We do not have a date set for our May episode. That's going to be coming out soon. So we'll be announcing our May horse racing hangout within the next couple days, I'm hoping. And the topic of that is going to be mental health in the thoroughbred industry. So we're actually going to be talking about, what are some of the challenges presented by the industry that can affect the mental health of our workforce. This is especially a good thing to consider if you are part of the workforce. What are some resources that you can actually access that are close to you? Or even if you're considering working in the industry, how can you access mental health resources? So we're going to be sharing some amazing speakers, some incredible resources, and some really great takeaway points. So stay tuned on that. You can always get a hold of me at info@amplifyhorseracing.org. Follow us on social media, and I hope you have a great rest